Hello, my name is Elia Paz. I'm a teaching assistant at Montana State University Northern. And for today's lecture, we'll be going over Chapter 8, Environmental Health and Safety, out of the textbook Public Health 101, Improving Community Health, by Richard Riegelman and Brenda Kirkwood. And for our learning objectives, we're going to be defining the scope of morbidity and mortality caused by the physical environment, including the unaltered environment, the altered environment, and the built environment, identifying the range of interactions that occur between human beings and the physical environment, identifying the components of environmental risk assessment and apply them to an environmental hazard, such as lead. We're also going to be distinguishing among a risk assessment, a public health assessment, and an ecological assessment, discussing the meaning of interactions and how they may impact the size of risks, describe the ways in which environmental health and safety relate to health protection in populations, discuss the problem of epileptic head injuries and potential interventions to reduce their burden, and discuss recently recognized health risks from the environment, such as forever chemicals. All right, so now to start the lecture, what do we mean by environment? It is an ambiguous term that can refer to a wide range of factors. It's often used to describe anything outside of genetics, so social, economic, and cultural factors. But in the context of this chapter on the environmental health and safety, we're going to focus on the physical environment, which can be thought of in essentially three categories: unaltered environment, altered, and built. So for unaltered, we're referring to the natural world. Human health has always been affected by natural forces such as tornadoes, earthquakes, and volcanoes. And these events have devastating effects on human health. On a daily basis, we're also exposed to natural elements like communicable diseases and water and food, which are a part of the unaltered environment. Now, as technology has advanced, we have come to understand more subtle impacts of the natural environment. For example, radon, a naturally occurring breakdown of uranium, can increase the risk of lung cancer when it accumulates in buildings. Similarly, natural exposure to sunlight increases the risk of skin cancer, such as melanoma, which is the potentially lethal form of skin cancer. Now, it's important to recognize that nearly every aspect of our natural environment has been altered by human activity. Most of these changes are aimed at improving health, like water treatment, waste management, mosquito control, and flood management. However, we must also consider the broader impact of these changes. Because of the global population growth, so around 2002, there were approximately 6 billion people, and then by 2014, 7 billion people. Now we're approaching 8 billion people. And this has significantly amplified our presence and our impact on the physical environment. And this significant growth is often linked to problems like deforestation and climate change. Now, our influence on the environment can be categorized into two main forms: consumption, which refers to the use of resources like land, food, water, and minerals; then waste products, which these are our byproducts of our consumption, such as air and water pollutants, greenhouse gases, and radiation from nuclear energy. You might also consider the introduction of invasive species, which is an unintended consequence of global trade. Now, the built environment is a relatively new concept. It refers to the impacts of human construction. So looking at impacts that go beyond what nature would have caused on its own. Now, impacts of the built environment include injuries in the home, transportation-related accidents, work and recreational injuries. Additionally, it affects how we heat our homes, cook food, and travel. And the built environment influences not just our safety, but also our activity levels and social interactions. And evidence suggests that the built environment can influence our mood, social interactions, and even our attitudes, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. Okay, so now what is the impact of the environment on health? Well, so measuring the impact of the environment on health is difficult because exposures may have long-term and subtle impacts. And the World Health Organization, or WHO, estimates that air pollution has the greatest environmental impact on health. Now, of course, to highlight the severity of the issue, so according to WHO, around 13 million deaths, or about 20% of all deaths, are due to avoidable environmental causes. Of these, half are related to air pollution. Our understanding of the impacts of air pollution has grown significantly, especially in recent years, with an increased focus on small particle pollution related to health. So what do we mean when we're talking about air pollution? Air pollution occurs when a mix of tiny solid and liquid particles are suspended in the air. And these particles can include acids, organic chemicals, metals, dust, pollen, and mold spores. And the size of the particles greatly influences their impact on health. So our bodies have natural defense mechanisms like coughing and sneezing to help protect against the larger particles. However, particles smaller than 10 micrometers in diameter can be inhaled deep into the lungs and even enter the bloodstream, which leads to greater risks. The smallest particles, those under 2.5 micrometers in diameter, are referred to as fine particles and are only visible under a microscope. And when millions of these tiny particles are suspended in the air, it creates smog, which is primarily seen in urban areas due to motor vehicle emissions. Now, for health effects, for short-term exposure, these can cause irritation to the eyes, nose, and throat, which can lead to shortness of breath, asthma attacks, and bronchitis. For long-term exposures, they can contribute to reduced lung function, chronic lung disease, and premature death. More recently, studies have shown a risk between air pollution and coronary artery disease, which leads to thickening of arteries and disrupting blood flow. All right, so now we have here is table 8.1, which is the air quality index, which is an effort to alert individuals of the air quality in the region by the EPA. Now, the air quality index specifically focuses on the health effects that people may experience within a few hours or days after exposure to unhealthy air. And the goal is to provide clear, actionable information to help individuals make informed decisions about outdoor activities based on the current air quality. So a good real-world example is living in Montana. So the past few summers we had really bad wildfire seasons. Since we say we got fires in Canada, California, and even Montana itself, on the Weather Channel you might see in this air quality report say good, moderate, unhealthy for sensitive individuals, and unhealthy, just to name a few. And a lot of times there's an example of saying the reporters would say limit your time outside. So that could be an example there. All right, so changing gears a little bit, we're focusing on the impact of occupational exposures and injuries. So many toxic exposures occur in occupational settings, and certain occupations are particularly vulnerable to injuries. For example, workers in mining, construction, and agriculture are at a high risk of both injuries and hazardous exposures. Now, occupational exposures that result in morbidity and mortality, so this can include, say, lung disease caused by exposure to hazardous dusts, hearing loss from loud noises, back pain from excessive lifting, as well as a wide range of other mechanical problems like carpal tunneling caused by repetitive motion of the hand wrist. Now, for say regarding cancer, it's estimated that around 5% of cancer deaths in males are linked to occupational exposure, like formaldehyde, benzene, or organic dyes, making it a significant concern. As we continue to refine occupational safety standards, we are seeing a decline in injuries and diseases related to work. However, in newly industrializing countries, the reverse is happening. As these nations grow their industries, they often see an increase in occupational injuries and diseases. All right. So how do we interact with our physical environment? To understand how the physical environment affects our health, we have to examine all the ways we interact with it. Every minute of every day, we're exposed to various elements of our environment through different routes. Our body has developed protective mechanisms for each of these routes to help minimize potential harm. And the primary routes of exposure are, starting off with skin, which provides us protection against radiation, organisms, and physical contact. It also offers some protection against heat and cold extremes. Next up, we have the respiratory tract. So referring to the respiratory system, so from nose to lungs, it is protected by mucus production and tiny hair-like structures called cilia. These structures move in sync with coughing, helping to remove larger particles that we inhale. Additionally, phagocytes, cells that are literally consuming larger particles, work alongside the antibodies and cell-mediated immunity to protect the body from harmful organisms and particles. Then we have our digestive tract, which is safeguarded by saliva, mucous membranes, antibodies, and a strong acidity in our stomach. These protective mechanisms help neutralize harmful substances that may be ingested. We also have the genital urinary tract, and this tract is also protected by mucous membranes, antibodies, and cell-mediated immunity. In some areas, an acidic environment adds another layer of defense against harmful invaders. Now, by understanding how our body interacts with the physical environment through these protective routes, we can better appreciate how our health is influenced by exposure to environmental factors. All right. Now, given the complexities of interactions between humans and the physical environment, a range of approaches has been developed to better understand and address these challenges. And these approaches can generally be grouped into four categories, which are risk assessment, public health assessment, ecological assessment, and interaction analysis. We will now take a closer look at each of these four methods and how they help us assess and mitigate potential environmental health risks. So, how does risk assessment address the impacts of the physical environment? Risk assessment involves understanding the potential dangers of an exposure. It's important to consider the following factors. First, we have the route of exposure. The consequences of exposure can depend whether it occurs via the skin, respiratory tract, or gastrointestinal tract. For example, inhaling a toxic substance versus absorbing it through the skin could have different effects on health. Then there's the time of the exposure. Short-term, high-dose exposures may not always have the same impact as long-term, low-dose exposures, even if the total exposure and routes are identical. For instance, experiencing a few severe sunburns as a child increases the risk of skin cancer much more than multiple mild sunburns as an adult. Now, by understanding these variables, risk assessments can provide a more accurate estimate of potential health impacts. All right. An all-scale risk assessment attempts to measure the impact of environmental exposures one at a time by measuring the types and magnitudes of the impacts. Now, if a substantial risk is found to exist, the process then reviews options to protect, detect, and react to the risk to minimize the burden of disease on humans. Now, the risk assessment process includes a margin of error to provide additional protection, especially for vulnerable populations or individuals. So this helps ensure that even if individuals are exposed to levels above maximum exposure limits, it doesn't guarantee adverse effects. All right, so now what we have here is figure 8.2, which is showing the four-step risk assessment process. Now, the following process of risk assessment is the current framework used to assess environmental hazards in the United States. And this process is essential for identifying potential environmental risks and determining the best ways to minimize their impact on human health. In the four-step risk assessment process illustrated in the figure is used by the US EPA to assess and manage those hazards. Now, these four steps include hazard identification, determining what health problems are caused by exposure to the environmental hazard. Then there's the dose response assessment, examining the relationship between the level of exposure and the likelihood of adverse health effects. Then there's exposure assessment, evaluating the amount of the hazard that individuals are exposed to and how they come into contact with it. Then there's risk characterization, combining information from the previous steps to estimate the overall risks of the hazard to human health. Now, by following the steps, the EPA can evaluate risks more systematically and create strategies to protect public health. All right, now going further along on the four-step risk assessment, here this table outlines that process, and it's using a simplified example of how airborne exposure, say benzene, in an occupational setting can be assessed. And we're going to break down each of the steps as it applies. So for step 1, hazard identification. In this case, the health hazard is benzene exposure, which can lead to serious conditions like leukemia and other blood disorders. Step 2, dose response assessment. Here we assess the relationships between the concentration of benzene in the air and the likelihood of harmful health effects. Higher levels of exposure generally correlate with greater risk. Then we have the exposure assessment, which is step 3. This step involves evaluating how much benzene workers are exposed to in the particular environment and the number of workers exposed. It may consider factors such as the duration of exposure, how often they are exposed, and the overall concentration of benzene in the air they breathe. Then we have step 4, risk characterization. After gathering all this information, we determine the overall risk. So we're combining data from the health or hazard identification, dose response assessment, and exposure assessment to predict the likelihood of harmful health outcomes and inform safety guidelines or regulations.